Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Voyage podcast, a production of Voyage Comics, where we seek to advance the truth, beauty, and goodness found in powerful stories. In this episode, we're going to be connecting the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell, which we talked about last time, to the Gospels themselves and how Jesus replays or lives out the hero's journey, and how in referring to the Gospels as myths, we're not saying they're unhistorical, but that they are connecting on that human level to the way that we tell stories. Okay, so one of the things that really stands out to me is we talked about Joseph Campbell when we were just going over the overview of the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell was very strongly influenced by the psychologist Carl Jung. So Carl Jung, he's very well known for presenting archetypes in mythology and in human psychology. And Joseph Campbell recognized this when he started putting together his monomyth, or the hero's journey. But another person who is also very influenced by Carl Jung is the psychologist and public speaker Jordan Peterson. And he has this quote that says, not that he's been identified as a Christian or anything like that, but he says, Jesus is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. In some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. Yeah, and that's where I think is a really good jumping off point. Right? Mm-hmm. And from a Christian perspective, maybe it reminds you of the true myth that J.R.R. Tolkien used to convince C.S. Lewis, which ultimately led to his conversion to Christianity. It's basically saying the same thing in different words, right?
Lewis would say that Jesus is a corn king, right?
Yeah.
And what was that, Mere Christianity? Probably. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe
so where he actually recounts the story with Tolkien, that's in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, is where he actually goes through that, right? Because that's where it actually covers the conversion.
But the Corn King line, does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah. So where he identifies it with the myth, I can't remember if it's Mere Christianity or not.
That's a funny way to put it.
Yeah, well, and it's not necessarily the most well-known of, maybe it's not the myth that you necessarily learn or grow up with when you have your mythology unit in third grade in, school or whatever.
Well, depending upon where you live, maybe describing Jesus as a corn king is, kind of the bee's knees. But at least Lewis thought so. And I respect that guy.
Maybe at the schools where you grew up saying the bee's knees.
Yeah.
That was like
What, kids don't know bees' knees these days? Hey, bees have knees too. Don't get me started. Let's go. Move on.
Yeah, thank you. So there's so many different elements to this, and really, I mean, even just in Peterson's quote of calling Jesus the union of those two things, think of the high Christology that he's incorporating. Neither of us know if he read the church fathers, if he's read the documents from the Council of Nicaea or Chalcedon, especially Chalcedon, right, or Ephesus. But this whole idea of union, right? Jesus is uniting God and creation. He's uniting divinity and humanity in the two natures. That's his whole thing, is union. And so now we can see Christ as the union between mythology and history, right? And that's exactly what we see in the Gospels.
Well, remind me again of the kind of, etymology or definition of myth as such.
Well, yeah, if you remember from our last episode, we talked about how the word myth just means thought or word, but one of the interesting things that comes out is that it actually can mean conversation, that it's a uniting between two people, right?
It's a communal story.
Communication. There's a union right there. Like, that's what it's meant to do, is through speech, through word, through thought, it brings two people together. You and I can be united in the same thought because of our ability to communicate.
And so when you think about monomyth, and you realize it's talking about the single communication, right? And then you build on top of that the idea that Christ is, everything wrapped up into him. He is the logos that defines all reality, right? Not to get too heady metaphysical for all y'all, but he is the monomyth. In literal theological sense, he is this story that is communicated in the hearts of everyone across all time and space. And he is the story that brings everything together. And
and actually, what we're first going to talk about is we're going to talk about how that is actually played out in the Gospels. But then after that, we're going to go further into what you just said, where he in himself he's the conversation between God and creation. And there's this concept in theology called exitus and reditus, where we see the exitus, the going forth from God. That's what creation ultimately is. And then the return back, the reditus, that's what Christ brings about. That's what he institutes. And if you remember from when we were talking about the monomyth, the hero's journey, is that there is an exitus. The hero must leave what is familiar. But just as important, the hero can't just conquer the enemy, can't just slay the dragon, but must return back the master of two worlds. And that's exactly why you need the exitus and the reditus. But like I said, first we got to just talk about the Gospels.
Well, all right. I just want to interject and say that I would make fun of you for all your Latin, except for the fact that Latin sounds so cool.
Hey, so, we first talked about myth and mythos, which is Greek, so...
Yeah, that's true. That's true. A lot of Greek and Latin, I can imagine going on here. But they're both pretty cool sounding languages, so... It's kind of like in Harry Potter when, everyone's like, Expelliarmus, or whatever. They just, like, make up weird sounding, vague language, right? See, we got real languages that still sound like Harry Potter spells.
See, so there's kind of like there's like a broke and a woke. Remember that meme, the text meme of broke and woke? And the broke meme is hating Harry Potter because it's got magic. Woke is hating Harry Potter because the Latin is sloppy. That's the real, the real ones, don't like it. Which, I mean, it's a children's story, right? She's not trying to teach Latin.
Oh, I mean, don't lower your standards too much. This is a Voyage podcast, comics podcast, Mike.
So, as an aside, when I was, my bachelor's is in teaching. I thought I was going to be an elementary school teacher. And so for my student teaching, where I have to go into a school, and it's kind of like an internship, but for teachers, right? And I had to teach lessons to these sixth graders. And fortunately it was fifth graders. And fortunately I had like the advanced reading group for fifth grade. So a lot of the kids were familiar with Harry Potter, had read Harry Potter. And so for my lesson that was going to be observed, I was going to teach them the Latin root words by letting them create their own spells. And so they had to put together these Latin phrases. And at first I was thinking
that's a way better idea than I thought you were capable of coming up with, Mike.
And well, I had to I actually remember being worried about this and saying, well, at least I was student teaching at a public school, and so I said I don't have to worry about people freaking out that I'm like teaching them magic or teaching them spells or something.
No, just Latin.
It's like, no, it's Latin, I promise. And they're like, wait, that sounds Catholic. That might be worse.
Yeah, that sounds suspiciously Catholic.
Right. So what I love about, as we were saying, not only the person of Jesus is the monomyth, like you said, but the Gospels themselves are structured to show you that he is. And one of the really big indicators, before you even get into the content of the Gospels, is the structure. The structure themselves, they are meant to repeat themselves in terms of, it's like retelling a similar story, but in different ways. So you have this sense of...
Are you talking about the four Gospels combined, or are you talking about the repetition of things within the
Well, here's the thing, is you see it within, I would say, especially the synoptic, the first three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But even within, I'll just take Matthew, for example. There's even this, it's called chiasm, within, and this is in biblical scholars talk about chiasm as a literary device or a literary structure that you see in a lot of ancient myths, but you see it in poetry too, where they will take a theme at the beginning, and then the story itself will send forth or diverge from that theme, but by the end of the story or by the end of the poem, you return back. And so you return back to that same theme. And so the Gospels themselves, they not only repeat themselves, especially in the first three, where it's like Matthew is telling you a story and then Mark is telling you a similar story but in a different way, or Luke is telling you a story in a different way. But even within the Gospel of Matthew, a really good example of that is at the beginning of Matthew, the angel, when Angel Gabriel is announcing to Mary, he doesn't say, that you're going to call him Jesus right away. The name that Gabriel says is that you will call him Emmanuel, and that means God with us. Now, that wasn't just to fulfill some prophecy, which it was meant to do, but Matthew was setting up this exitus, which we would return back to, the reditus, or the hero will emerge from this at the beginning and then return back to this idea. Because at the end of Matthew, what does Jesus say before he leaves, before he exits the stage? Is he says, I will be with you always till the end of the age. And so here we have, he's going to be called Emmanuel, which means God with us at the beginning of Matthew. And then we return back to that at the end, I will be with you. And hey, I wonder if it's trying to tell you something about Jesus, that he is God with us.
Nice. So it all comes full circle. I see it.
That's the image for the hero's journey is a circle. So full circle is very appropriate.
Yeah, right. And well, it's almost like I know what I'm talking about, right? That's what I'm going to say. It's like, of course.
That's the whole
Of course,
idea,
the circles. Right? Yeah, I mean, duh. Like, come on, circle, bro.
So now, not just that it's only in the structure. I mean, if the structure alone, I think, is a really strong indicator, because that's how they would tell ancient stories, right? Is following the same kind of, not just chiasm, but monomythic. The hero leaves, fulfills the quest, or does all the things he or she needs to, and then returns, the master of two worlds. But even within a lot of the content. So, again, think of the monomyth in terms of returning back, right, and being the master of two worlds. Well, what was the resurrection? The resurrection was not only Jesus leaving heaven, coming to earth, and then returning back at the ascension, returning back to heaven, the master of both worlds, but the resurrection is sort of a monomyth in miniature. He leaves this world, he goes to the land of the dead, he goes to Hades, or death itself, masters that world, and returns in the resurrection, the master of both. And the whole thing about the hero's journey is, it's not so much that the world outside is changed when the hero comes back. It's that the hero himself, or the hero herself, is changed. And that's exactly the whole thing about the resurrection, is that it was the same Jesus, but he was kind of different. People didn't recognize him, or they knew it was the same Jesus because he had the scars, but he was able to do these things that they hadn't seen him done before, or they didn't recognize him until this certain point. And so he was the same, but also different.
Well, there's an interesting, and it probably just works on levels, right? In the sense that, like, even Christ coming into humanity, right, is him entering into, the wilderness, the land of the dead kind of thing, our human flesh, right? And then ultimately, having done all the things he does in his incarnate form, ascending back home with his boon, and his boon being us, right? Like, or creation itself, returning it back to the Father, to the community that he came out of, that community being the Trinity. But,
I love that you used us as the boon, because it's like, what can you give to God? You can't give God anything that God doesn't already have except yourself. And that's exactly what the resurrection and the ascension is, right? Is we are, we're the prize, which, I mean, gosh, that's just got to make you feel special, doesn't it?
Yeah, downright. Almost like I'm Stardust or something, right? That's how people try to make themselves feel special nowadays. Like, oh, you're Stardust, bro. And it's like, I mean, so is the stuff under the sink. But that's cool. If that does it for you.
So,
I like my story better.
So, okay, I can't believe that I have to reference the broke and woke text meme again. But that was
You're running out of material, and it's only episode 2, Mike.
I know, but so that whole idea of we're stardust, that was posted by a certain sarcastic scientist who shall remain nameless, but so my sort of like response was, the broke meme is we're made of the same stuff of stars, but the woke meme is that we're made of the same stuff of Jesus, and so it's that same exactly what you were saying. So you mentioned in the last episode, though, and remember, I kind of cut you off because I didn't want you to. I wanted to save something for this one. Yeah, okay. That's between the two of us. You're definitely the one with that problem. No, you mentioned the concept of recapitulation, and I said, "Oh yeah, we're going to talk about that actually in our second episode because that's where we really get into the stuff about the Bible." So there's, why don't you go ahead and just go over the concept of recapitulation, where do we see it in Christian history, and then we can talk a little bit more about where we see it played out in the Gospels themselves.
Well, the internet, Wikipedia, I don't know, I'm just making that up. Recapitulation is something that I'm familiar with from Saint Irenaeus, right, who was an early bishop who wrote some really, really interesting stuff against heresies and things like that. He also did this wonderful document that was actually recently discovered called The Demonstration of the Apostolic Teaching. But your church historian types or your adjunct theology professor types are going to talk about how Saint Irenaeus is kind of the perfect example of early Christian thought regarding what Christ accomplished in his incarnation and the salvation that he brings to humanity. And the basic gist of that is that he recapitulates in his person everything that has come already, and he basically undoes or redoes creation itself through his activity, and that's exemplified in his life, death, and resurrection.
And think about how, like, when you say he redoes, he relives, I mean, that's basically what Joseph Campbell was recognizing in the monomyth. Now, in the monomyth, he wasn't talking specifically about Jesus. He was saying that in all of these heroes, they are reliving some basic human story. Now, we just happen to recognize it. And again, this doesn't diminish the divinity of Jesus. This, in many ways, it upholds or glorifies the humanity of Jesus, which, as a historic Christian, you got to hold both of those.
Oh, some people think that it's some kind of like negative thing, that the what Christ does is the ultimate example of every story ever made, and people will say, oh, that just means that it's not special, right?
It relativizes it,
or it relativizes it, or it's just another story at that point, kind of thing. But I've never, I mean, I guess I can follow the logic of that argument, but I don't really buy it as a convincing argument. I think that if you believe that something's true, and if Jesus' story just didn't match the criteria of what's true to the human condition, to the lived experience, to what brings humans together, and speaks to the hearts of all people throughout all time, and if Jesus' story doesn't do that, then then that's unimpressive, right? Then Jesus found $20, right? That's not a good story. Jesus' story is the best version of all stories.
So, and one of the essential elements from Irenaeus' point of view, when we talk about recapitulation, or the recapitulation that Jesus brought about, wasn't just, like you were saying, it wasn't just a reliving, but a fulfilling. And a really good example that comes to mind, you mentioned earlier Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. And that's actually one of the most prominent examples of recapitulation And I can't remember if Irenaeus brings that up specifically, but I know it's a very commonly used example, because who else do we see with the number 40 in the wilderness and being tempted? Well, we see the ancient Israelites with Moses. And so we have, and what are the Israelites tempted with? They're tempted with food. And what's the first temptation in the wilderness with Jesus is turn these stones into bread. And so the gospel writer, and again, whether we're talking Matthew, Mark, or Luke, especially the synoptics, they are putting Jesus in the place of Israel, the nation, God's chosen people. Now it's recapitulate. That means like kaput means head. He is like the head of this group, right? Just as Moses was. Jesus is the new Moses, but he's the new Israel. He's reliving their story, and where Israel failed, he is succeeding.
Well, so, and Moses was frequently the language is a shadow, right? But everything that happens in the story of the Israelites is an icon of Christ, is an example of Christ, and he's the true story that all the story of Israel, points to. And there's actually this interesting kind of inversion when you talk about recapitulation, that ultimately everything's just a foreshadowing of Christ.
Well, and the main focus that we're talking about is how Christ recapitulates or fulfills these stories, but there's even precedent in just the Old Testament, in just the Jewish scriptures. If you just take the Jewish scriptures, if you just take the book of Genesis, there are examples of recapitulation. And again, this goes back to the church fathers, but even the Jewish rabbis recognized that the temptation, when we think of Noah, we think primarily of the ark, we think primarily of the flood. But after the ark and after the flood, there was
nothing
a
controversial
temptation.
Happened.
Yeah.
Nothing controversial happens after the flood with Noah.
No, that's, like when you put together
I was in Sunday
bedroom,
school. I remember the Sunday school stories.
When you put together the new baby's bedroom,
they live happily ever after. They get off the ark. They live happily ever after, and
go forth and multiply. Well, even getting off the ark before it goes wrong, he does say, "Go forth and multiply," just like he said to Adam and Eve. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that the Noah story is recapitulating the Adam story, not just in you're now given this new creation, right? Noah is the main guy. He has dominion over all the earth after the flood. He's told to go forth and okay, we're gonna cut this part out. I can't think of the word. But then after that command, and like I said, Noah has dominion over the earth. He is tempted, and he's tempted with the fruit of the vine, right? He's tempted with the fruit, just like Adam and Eve were tempted with the fruit. And it leads to a sin, which then, gets us all kind of started over again. It starts the whole thing over again. And so Noah, was a new Adam in a sense. He recapitulated Adam. And this happens not just with him. I mean, we see in the story of David, one of the biggest lines, and I can't remember if it's his coronation, I believe, but the people say, bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. They have this marital union between the king and the kingdom, just like when Eve comes forth from Adam. And so David is put up as he recapitulates the Adam story, not just in the high points, but as many of us know, and again, this goes back to your Sunday school thing, it's not just David and Goliath, it's not just David dancing before the ark, it's also David and his fall as well. So there's one more example, going back to the New Testament, of this recapitulation. Not only do we see the Old Testament patriarchs recapitulating themselves, reliving that same story in different ways, not only do we see Jesus recapitulating the entire Old Covenant, the entire Old Testament, and fulfilling it, but his first followers, the church itself is supposed to be a recapitulation of the life of Christ. And we see that in Acts of the Apostles. Acts of the Apostles was sometimes called the fifth gospel because it was supposed to be a telling of the life of Christ, but not Christ the head in Jesus, Christ the body, the church. because that's where we see the story of the early church. And so in many examples, when Luke, traditionally and historically very pretty much established the author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles, Luke is purposely putting certain phrases or certain images in Acts of the Apostles to identify those characters with Jesus. And I think the most prominent example that comes to my mind is the martyrdom of St. Stephen. How the language of the people killing him, the language of Stephen himself, is supposed to be a parallel to when Jesus is killed on the cross. And so there we have a similar sort of recapitulation.
Well, and basically every call to action that we have from the apostles is to be imitators of Christ, right? And so if you start going through even the epistles in the New Testament, or even the book of Revelation, when you start to get into the reality of the martyrs and things like that, and some of the stuff that's talked about in that wild and wacky book we all know and love, you are seeing a lot of the reality of Christ's bride going through a passion similar to what Christ did. And again, it's all just cycling back on itself. And one of the things that a lot of people, you won't necessarily hear, it took a while for me to have someone explain this to me, but the book of Revelation is really kind of quite liturgical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so whether
it's almost like you're trying to transition into the next, because I was waiting for it actually. Go ahead and fit it, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, you could have not called it out, and then it would have just been a perfect transition into the next thing. But
no, we get meta and self-referential.
We're seeing how the sausage is made here.
We lean right into it on this one, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But sorry, go ahead and keep going about the liturgy, because that's exactly where you should be going. By the way, that's where I'm nudging.
It's like it's plotted out.
I know, I'm pulling all the strings.
Mike the puppet master over here. But so anyway, the liturgy, whether it's Mass or it's an Orthodox liturgy or whatever, but liturgical worship within Christianity has always been the continuation of the liturgical worship from the Old Testament. Christ comes to fulfill the law. But then it is the embodiment of Christ and Christ's journey, and we recapitulate that every Sunday, and it is eternally being present right before the throne of God, as demonstrated in the book of Revelation. What were you going to say, Mike?
Well, and it's crazy that I was just listening to this today, and I really can't remember which church father said it, but one of the church fathers said that if you can't imitate Christ in his martyrdom, then the closest way to imitate Christ is in the Paschal mystery, in the liturgy. And so that's exactly what the liturgy is meant to do. And like I said, that's the liturgy itself, just like the patriarchs recapitulated the story of Adam, just as Christ recapitulated the story of the patriarchs, just as the apostles recapitulated Christ, we in the church now recapitulate that same story. How do we do it? Yes, we do it by, praying. Yes, we do it by doing good works or doing charitable things. But ultimately, or the highest form of recapitulating Christ is in the liturgy.
I like to think of the liturgy as we're performing a play, but we are both the actors and the audience, and Christ is both the actor and the audience, and we are performing, living. It's a shame to think of it as allegorical, right? We are truly impersonating Christ. We are embodying Christ. The Eucharist is the flesh and blood of Christ. In the Orthodox liturgy, the priest says, "Thy own of thine own, offered on behalf of all and for all," as
Through
he's
him, with him, and in him for our Western listeners.
there. You go, though, right? Same basic idea. I'm sure it's said at the same basic time. Um, and we are, I read this great book once that was talking about when does, and so this might be a little bit loosey-goosey Eastern talk here, but the question was, when does the liturgy start? When does the liturgy start? And the way this author put it, he said the liturgy starts when you wake up that morning and prepare yourself through prayer to actually go to the liturgy. It begins all the way back at that point. And as you journey to the church to come together as the collective, as the people of God, you've already begun a liturgical act, let's say. And so that idea that you are coming into the promised land, that you're getting there, and that you are meeting the Messiah, and the Messiah is going to go through his journey and all the way unto death, and then through death unto resurrection. We're going to participate in that entire experience, and then we are going to go and be sent back out into the world, just like the apostles were. And we are going to recapitulate that experience. And we're going to do that for a while until we do the whole process all over again the next Sunday. And we are just going to keep that cycle going. And then obviously the church itself, like the calendar year itself, is its own cycle. And so everything about the liturgical calendar and the liturgical experience is nothing but cycles within cycles within cycles, in which we are constantly revolving through the experience of Christ over again, and ascending as we do it.
And not only so, you were first talking about the liturgy itself, then you're talking about the liturgical cycles or the liturgical year. But I want to go back to, it's not only in the story, it's that story gets played out even in our actions in the liturgy. So there's so many different points in the liturgy where we have this this going forth, right? Just like the hero does at the beginning, the call to adventure, but then the return. And I think of all the examples where the priest will take something and hold it up high, right? To go up high is to represent, sending it up to God, sending it up to heaven. But it's being sent back, it's being returned. So from our perspective, right, it's going on this journey, but it's not just that our gifts are being sent up. The real gift, and we talked about this earlier, the real gift, so to speak, is ourselves. We're giving ourselves over. But then what does God return back? And the best example, you mentioned the Eucharist. We give just the plain bread and the plain wine, right? When it's first brought forward, the priest will hold it up high as an offering, right? Accept this bread that we offer you, fruit of the vine, or fruit of the earth, work of human hands. It shall become our spiritual food. Accept this wine we offer you, fruit of the vine, work of human hands. It shall become our spiritual drink. It's first offered as bread and wine. So it's offered up to God just as bread and wine, but then it's returned back to us. And there's this action that the priest does where he will lower his hands, hold his hands down over it, and that part of the liturgy is called the epiklesis. So there's another Greek word for you, Jacob.
Yay.
The epiklesis, which means invocation, because he is invoking the Holy Spirit. And I love the line that you'll sometimes hear, depending on which version of the prayer the priest will say, is, Lord, send down your Spirit upon these gifts like the dewfall, which is exactly how the manna was described in Exodus, is that it was described as dew that came down upon the ground. Mm-hmm. And so it invokes not only the bread Eucharistic image of the manna, but also that the Holy Spirit is the one that gave the manna to the Israelites in the Old Testament, just like the Holy Spirit is the one who gives us the new manna in the body of Christ in the new covenant. But we have this going up, this going forth, and then this return. But then right after the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, what does the priest do again? He first offered it up or held it up when it was bread and wine. Now he holds it up as the new offering, the body and blood of Christ. And so we have this going forth again, but now it's a new gift.
Mm-hmm.
But what does God do? He returns it right back to us.
So
when we receive communion.
And you can speak to, because I've been to a number of masses, and I don't know if I recollect seeing this, but it might just be circumstantial. You can let me know. But we actually have a procession, right? And that procession in the Orthodox Church, there's a procession in which the priest will come out from the altar. And of course, in an Orthodox church, you're going to have that iconostas, a wall of icons that separates the nave from the altar. And usually there's doors or curtains, right? He'll come out from behind the altar, and he'll process with the gifts, and he will encircle the people, and then he will walk back to the altar, and then he'll stand in front of the altar, and he'll offer a series of prayers, basically, and intercessions and things like that, before entering back into the altar. But you do get this idea, it's called the Great Procession, and he is coming back out amongst the people, and then as a representative of the people, he is presenting the gifts back to God along with our prayers.
And the fact that he's encircling all of you, it's almost like you're being collected just as much as the bread and the wine are.
Yeah, I mean,
so that
I
you're
feel
becoming,
like that's probably,
that you're being, that's probably the theology behind it, would be
something there to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in terms of the Gospels, the New Testament, the liturgy, I feel like we've connected it very well to that hero's journey. But is there even something behind this? Is there a theology even behind what we see played out or incarnated in the Gospels or in the liturgy itself? And that's where, going back to this exitus and reditus idea that that we were talking a little bit about before. And there's this concept, again, it's not exclusively necessarily in Thomas Aquinas, but I think he's one of the best examples of how this idea is fleshed out. And the primary example is in his biggest work, the Summa Theologiae, where he doesn't actually talk about exitus and reditus, but the entire structure of the book itself, is structured as a going forth from God, an exiting from God, and then a return back to God. And that's, like I said, exactly what exitus and reditus is meant to be. But it almost answers the question, why did every human story, why does this monomyth or hero's journey, why does it follow this same pattern? Why does it follow the same cycle? Because it parallels, it imitates the relationship that God has created with us. A relationship of going forth from God, from the mind of God or from the thought of God. And then what is meant to happen is there is meant to be a return back. This same creation is meant to return back, into God, so to speak. So I teased before about how the Summa is actually structured that way. So if you look at the three parts of the Summa, and you'll see in a lot of modern publications or modern translations, there's a supplemental part or a fourth part. That was actually meant to be part of part 3. It's just that was the section that had to be completed by Thomas's students because he didn't complete it himself and then he died. But it really would have been part of part 3. But it's called the supplementum. But anyway, in part 1, the entire section of part 1 is talking about God, the nature of God, and then at the end of part 1 it talks about creation. So that's where we talk about the creation of the angels, the creation of man, or the creation of humans. So that's part 1. Part 2 then is talking primarily about not just the creation of man, but the nature of humanity itself. So we have that going forth from God, right? That was part 1. And then there's the part 2, the initiation, which is the life of man. And so that's in part 2 is where you'll find Thomas's discussion of sin, Thomas's discussion of law, Thomas's discussion of the virtues, and the psychology of humanity, because that's the initiation, that's the actual journey part. And then part 3, guess what part 3 is about? If you're thinking along our hero's journey and it's the return, who does Thomas need to talk about in part 3? What's our return? What's humanity's return back to God?
We're talking about Christ?
I am talking about Christ. Guess what part 3 of the Summa is about? It's all about Christ. The entire section of the Summa, part 3. Yeah. We won't make it sound so much like a quiz when it's edited. So,
well, I don't know.
But I can't take that hat off.
Answer it right, then I guess.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have to do a second take. You can. We'll definitely let the audience know.
Nailed it.
So part 3 is all about Christ. And so that's where, the first question is, why did God become man? Or why was it fitting for God to become man? Because that is creation's return back to God. That's the return of the hero's journey, of the monomyth. And Jesus is, like you said earlier, Jesus is the monomyth. He is our return back. Now, I've said before how, you'll see there's a supplement part, but it should have been part of part 3 if Thomas had finished it before he died. Well, that supplemental part is included in part 3 because what is the means of humanity's return back to God? Yes, it's Jesus, but what is that extension of Jesus that returns humanity back to God? The sacraments. And that's what the supplement is all about. Thomas was actually able to finish his treatise on baptism and the Eucharist before he died. But then he wasn't able to get the rest of the sacraments done. But it all would have been part of part 3 because the sacraments, as an extension of Christ, is humanity and all of creation's return back to God. That's the last leg of the hero's journey.
Sure. And so by sacraments, is he kind of talking about the life of the church as such? Is he breaking it down specifically into the sacraments, or is he talking about the nature of the church and the means of grace found within it and things like that?
So he does have a section on the church as well. So in his section on Christ, you will see his section on the church. It's not as fleshed out of an ecclesiology as you'll see like in more modern theology or more modern theologians, but people can draw a lot from it because if the whole idea is that the church is the body of Christ, then anything that can be said or shown about Christ, by extension, can be shown of the church. So yeah, but like he'll break, go into each sacrament. So like on his section on baptism, be like, is baptism necessary, or is this necessary for baptism, or what does baptism do, or where does baptism draw its strength, all that stuff.
Sure. And so basically the manifestation of Christ through his people, through the life of the church, where do we go next with this information?
Well, so not only is the hero's journey a reflection of God's relationship with creation, the exitus and reditus, like we were saying, but even within the individual Christian, within the individual person, there is this same hero's journey that's happening. And this has been standardized or codified by a lot of different Christian saints, theologians, doctors of the church, teachers of the church. And you'll see it in the East and the West, even if the language is not necessarily the same. But you'll see these 3 stages of the spiritual life.
Well, I like this because I'm always trying to convince my kids that their life is a heroic epic that they're living out, through mundane things like taking the trash out or weeding the yard. But I get inspiration from, the simple things in life, the simple reality of living, and understanding it as a heroic journey. Maybe there's not a lot of explosions going on, God willing, right?
It's not a Michael Bay.
Maybe it's not directed by Michael Bay, but I think that's what's missing from people's kind of monotony. The monotony of modernity is that they don't have a sense of the heroic in their lives. You mentioned Peterson, or have we talked about Peterson? At any rate,
at the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
He's the one who had that quote about Jesus being the thing that unites myth and history.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that is this episode. I didn't want to reference something that wasn't within this conversation, but Peterson, I think what really captivated his audience was bringing into their lives the sense of the heroic, and the Christian life is a heroic life by any standard, and it sounds like that's where we're going in this conversation. So So
Well,
keep
and
going.
that's really the main reason why I wanted to do an episode on the monomyth and the hero's journey, is because it is ubiquitous. It's in every story. It's in every myth. This is pre-Christian myths, if we're talking Greek or Norse or whatever, but it's also in the post-Christian myth, like you were saying. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they are telling the monomyth. They're telling the hero's journey. And so to be able to recognize that, but then to also recognize it in Christ, and how we in the church are reliving the life of Christ, that means, like you said, we have our own hero's journey. And even if it looks a little bit, right, even if it recapitulates Christ in a different or more modern way, it can still be, or it is still meant to be, a recapitulation of Christ. And that's exactly what the 3 stages of the spiritual life, but it's also what the lives of the saints are. The lives of the saints are recapitulations of Christ in a unique setting, in a unique person, in a unique circumstance. But I don't want to leave this hanging. So the 3 stages of the spiritual life. The first one is called the purgative way. So purgative means purifying. That's what purgatory or purgation means, is just purifying. And so this is the stage of the spiritual life where one has turned from sin and is seeking purification, is beginning to find ways to purify their thoughts and their actions. And so that is that first leg, which begins, you could say it begins on that first turning towards, or that first repentance. But then from a Christian standpoint, they would say ultimately it really begins at baptism, is when that purification happens. The next stage is called the illuminative way, like illumination or enlightening. It's the stage of the spiritual life where one's understanding of God and virtue starts to grow. And so you can see how, going back to the purgative a little bit, that ties very much to the hero's journey, like we were saying, of the hero needs to be called to adventure. The hero even needs to struggle with that call and maybe even refuse the call, which the purgative way often, it doesn't mean that you don't sin anymore. It doesn't mean that you don't struggle with sin anymore, even though you're being purified of it. That's why the purification is necessary. And now in the illuminative way, as you're going through those trials, you start to recognize, you start to be illuminated to ultimately who you are or who God is making you. And then finally you have the unitive way, which is the third way, and it's the way that really all Christians are destined for, and what we see in the lives of the saints. It's the stage of the spiritual life where one is completely directed towards God. And it's unitive because you are united to God.
And all of this is taking place within the human heart, manifesting itself in the reality. Like what you were saying was, at no point should we anticipate that purgation, maybe you can speak to this more than I could, I suppose, but the illuminative, you're probably still, if you're not wasting away in sin, you're still fighting the good fight, right? You're running the race until the last lap. There's this great story from a desert father, Saint Macarius, and Saint Macarius is spent his entire life out in the desert, out in the wilderness, handling his business, dealing with the onslaught of Satan and the demons out there, and he's done it fairly well, all things considered. And so at the end of his life, he receives a vision, and he sees the door to heaven open up, and he brings himself up. You can imagine this kind of thin, bony saint who's practiced an ascetic life, for decades, hobbling, in his old age to this door into the kingdom, and he gets one foot through it, and then right at the end, he hears a voice behind him, says, "Congratulations, Macarius, thou hast conquered." And Macarius turns around, and he sees Satan there, having just said that, and he puts his bony finger up and he says, "Not yet." And then he takes the final step into the kingdom, right? But these stages, this epic heroism, because I think that's one of the great one-liners in all the stories of the saints, right? That's the yippee-ki-yay line that you get from Saint Macarius. to Satan, just refusing to admit that, letting his guard down even for a moment, even though he's at this point surely gone through this purgative and illuminative and unitive stage, right?
Well, so that's the thing, is actually he's on the threshold of the unitive.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Because that's exactly, because actually, so, well, I have a story that talks about the unitive of another desert father. As soon as you want to go ahead and finish up.
Oh, that's all I got. I mean, I can't beat. And then he found $20.
Yeah, yeah. There's this. I think it's the line. I think it's the title of his stand-up special, but it's "Not Today, the Devil," or "Not Today, Satan." And so I think it's Pete Holmes. If you're familiar with the comedian Pete Holmes, I think it's "Not Today, the Devil," or something like that. So that's, unfortunately, that's where my mind went when you mentioned, of course,
yeah,
this very holy desert father. But there's this anonymous desert father. And it's a story, it's compiled in the sayings or the writings of the fathers as well. And it actually speaks to the unitive way. Like where you were talking about Macarius, where he's at that last step, right? Because ultimately we can experience the unitive way imperfectly in this life. But that's what heaven is uniting ourselves with God. It's the reditus, it's the return. And we get moments of it, right? That's why we were talking about how myth comes from the word communication and how that's uniting us. And how we receive the Eucharist, we receive Holy Communion, because imperfectly we are united, not just to the bread, we are united to the body of Christ. Not just Christ the head in Jesus, we're actually united to the church by receiving communion as well. But those are all imperfect. So the story that I'm reminded of the Desert Fathers as well is, do you remember the one where the holy monk was studying, was praying. He wanted to know how to become holy, how to become, like how to grow in holiness, how to become a saint.
Yeah.
And this
master
monk.
No.
So yeah. And he asked the monk, and the monk turns and he holds his hands up, and flames come as if they were candles. And he says, "Why not be utterly changed into fire?" And what that monk was showing through this miracle, basically, is that he had become so close to, and of course, fire being a symbol of the Holy Spirit, fire being a symbol for God, he had become, by uniting himself in thought, word, and deed, he had been living out this unitive way. And that the expectation isn't that everybody's going to have flames coming from their fingers, of course. It's that sometimes God will grant these extraordinary circumstances or extraordinary miracles to illustrate actually the destiny for all of us. That we are all made to become fire. Why not all be utterly changed into fire?
Like the Human Torch, right? That's what we're talking about here. I can be a superhero.
Oh, I hadn't quite gone that far. The Fantastic Four hasn't come into play yet. But maybe the Invisible Woman is the kind of like the kenosis, right? Where God empties himself. Or really, she's the contemplation of Mary, right? Where she, right? Okay.
Well, she does, one of her superpowers is that she can create little safety bubbles, right?
The force field, yeah?
Yeah,
that's the womb.
So
that is the womb.
That's the, well, I was going to say, that's the, oh shoot.
The mantle.
Yeah, the mantle. Yeah.
The mantle. Yeah, right, under Mary's mantle.
There you go.
Okay. That maybe deserves its own episode. We haven't really, I'd have to, it's been a long time since I've gone into the Fantastic Four comics, but I'll probably, just to troll everybody, I'll probably just bring up the movies. The hated movies.
Exactly. All of them. Because there's
I know. Nobody has liked any of the Fantastic Four
none of them have been successful.
Yet.
But eventually the Human Torch goes on to become Captain America. So maybe there's some kind of...
That's an alternate universe. Now that we're in the multiverse, that's in one of the
right. Now it's a multiverse. That was Captain America the whole time.
Yep. Because really the Reed Richards was different too.
Yeah. Well, he's always different. But okay. Anyway, we'll let it lay. We're coming back to that.
So really, we see, like, that is what the lives of the saints are. Is they're reliving the life of Christ. They're showing this recapitulation or this hero's journey in their own unique way. And just like we see it played out in the pre-Christian myths of the Greek heroes or the Norse gods or whatever, or we see it played out in the post-Christian myths, which we, jokingly referred to some superheroes, but really, I mean, think of Tony Stark. Tony Stark is probably the best, at least the most fleshed out modern hero's journey. If we talk about like cultural relevance, how he was called forth. He was very reluctant to that call. It was necessity that brought him to accept that call, really. That he had that, divine guidance or help or whatever. And then we see that return, right? And there's a really powerful, really just think of like that final scene. And, I don't know if it's a big deal to spoil Endgame at this point, but like the fact that he had to like unite himself to the Infinity Stones to fulfill that goal.
Uh-huh.
That was like an apotheosis. And really think of what happens after again, when he snaps his fingers and he goes to that, he has that vision sort of, that's the apotheosis of Tony Stark,
Oh man, that's such an epic moment too. Like truly, they set that up across 20
films,
epic
moment.
Yeah.
Well, it's an epic moment because it resonates on that human level that we've seen 100%. With all of our heroes.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so, like I said, I think that's the best like modern example, post-Christian myth of the hero's journey. But it's played out in all of them. Steve Rogers has his own in the MCU as well. Not that I'm gonna like keep going back to that hobby horse or something, but like.
Well, it's hard to miss. It's so ubiquitous in our culture today, and we're gonna mine that stuff for all it's worth. There's no avoiding it. Neither should we, right? But,
well, no, that's the whole idea. That's what Campbell was saying too, is that it's unavoidable because it's human. It's who we are. It's how we unite ourselves to others through myth, through stories.
Beautiful.
So really, it's not it's not so much are you going to go somewhere? Are you going to be called forth and are you going to return? It's where are you being called to and where are you returning? Ultimately, God is going to send, you are going to be sent. And obviously you're going to have opportunities to refuse the call. You're going to have opportunities to resist the temptress. You're going to need to atone with the Father in some way, whatever that's going to look like. Oh my gosh, atonement with the Father and Tony Stark. Geez, we didn't even get there, But it's like, I forgot about that I forgot about that part of the hero's journey.
Subplot, yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. It's like, it's like the guy it's like the person who put Tony Stark or Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man in there. It's like he was purposely hitting all these points, but
or rather couldn't avoid them, right?
Couldn't avoid them, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just Tony Stark was like Jesus because he sacrificed himself. Yes, there's truth to that, but there's so much more. And like I said, once you recognize these steps, these specific steps that have been a part of all of mythology, then it is unavoidable. And it's not just unavoidable to see the mythological, it's unavoidable to see Christ. Well, yeah, no, I really enjoyed getting to explore this topic a little bit further. We got to go into the Gospels. We got to talk about how it connects to Christian theology. So, yeah, thanks for coming on, Jacob. This was, as always,
another home run.
Yeah.
I'd listen to it.
You just did, right? But,
yeah, right? I was there. In the flesh.
Well, thanks everybody for listening. You can read about this and other interesting subjects on the Voyage blog. The Voyage blog is devoted to testing everything and finding God in popular entertainment, focusing on comics, fantasy, and sci-fi. All of the links, resources that we mentioned, you can find in the show notes. Thank you to our sponsors. And remember, keep your eyes fixed on Christ, and you will find him everywhere.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.